Tonight is part 2 of the fascinating conversation that we had with Patrycja Slawuta, the psychologist from New York City, as she's been talking about, interviewing Dr. Eli Kotler, the psychiatrist. So we'll be introducing them very soon again, and everyone's looking forward to this part 2 of this very interesting conversation. So to begin with, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on wherever we meet and wherever we are, the elders, past and present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge the elders' wisdom traditions, cultures and communities who have used these medicines for thousands of years for their intelligence and healing potential. We acknowledge them for bringing these medicines through the ages so that we still are in touch with them and understand their healing potential and can help the millions and, well, hundreds of millions of people globally who are suffering. So Ilan, we'll just show the first introductory slides and then I'll introduce the presenters as usual. So we show these slides because there's always new people on our webinars. So this webinar is called The Psychology of Addiction Part 2. And we'll elaborate on that further soon. We don't encourage or facilitate illegal use of psychedelics or plant medicines. Our focus is entirely medical. And we do reserve the right to record and publish webinars on various social media, and we are recording this session. And if you've got friends or others who would like to access these webinars, we have a YouTube channel which has all the webinars for the entire year on it, and we encourage you to go and have a look and share them wherever you can. Next slide, thank you. Mental illness is now at alarming levels and getting worse in Australia. We were only second behind Iceland in the world statistics for mental illness, which is pretty tragic when you consider that Australia is quite a different type of country than Iceland. Before COVID and the bushfires, we had 1 in 5 Australian adults with a chronic mental illness, 1 in 8 on antidepressants, including 1 in 4 older Australians, children as young as 5 being prescribed antidepressants and other psychiatric medicines. An estimated 1 in 2 of us will suffer a mental illness in our lifetime. And sadly, since COVID, we've seen a major escalation in these figures, with up to 4 or 5 Australians reporting that their mental health has deteriorated through this crisis. In Victoria, statistics such as 33% of Victorians, young Victorians have there's an increase of 33% in self-harm by young Victorians, increase of suicides, increase of relationship breakdowns, of domestic violence, of course, and a whole range of other things. Next slide, thank you. So there sadly has been no improvement in treatment outcomes over the past 50 years. In the case of depression, only 35% of sufferers experienced remission from pharmacotherapy or psychotherapy. Side effects are significant, and many patients may experience some kind of response, but this often plateaus to the extent where psychiatrists like Eli will then have to either change the medication or increase it. And unfortunately, as we can see, these remissions are also very low in the case of PTSD. So more of the same approach is not going to solve the problem. We desperately need innovation in treatments. Next slide. So we're focused on medicinal psilocybin for depression and potentially OCD and addiction, and medicinal MDMA for PTSD and possibly the treatment of addiction as well. But what we're also seeing now is a number of trials around the world for both psilocybin and MDMA for also other conditions such as eating disorders, including anorexia, aging disorders, including dementia, a range of addictions as well, and even cluster headaches. The remarkable thing about these medicines is that they only require 2 to 3 dose sessions, in contrast to potentially a lifetime of therapy and a lifetime sentence of mental illness. These medicinally dosed sessions are in combination with psychotherapy, and that's a very important part of the treatment. The medicines are considered curative, not palliative. So it's not just about managing the condition, as I said, for the rest of your life or your children's life or whoever's lives we're talking about here. And we're talking about millions of lives, millions of people who are suffering. The medicines are considered very safe in a medically controlled environment and are non-addictive. Both have been granted breakthrough therapy designation by the Food and Drug Administration in the US to fast-track the approval process. And this is only given to medicines considered vastly superior to existing treatments. Next slide, thank you. So Mind Medicine's a charity that was set up by my husband and I, my husband Peter Hunt and I, to help alleviate the suffering caused by mental illness in Australia through expanding the treatment options available to medical practitioners and their patients. Our goal is to establish safe and effective psychedelic-assisted treatments to cure a range of mental illnesses. Our primary focus has been on medicinal psilocybin for depression and MDMA for PTSD because these medicines are in final stage of trials with the FDA. But we're also interested in other psychedelics, including ketamine, ibogaine, ayahuasca, and DMT. For us, success will be that these medicines and therapies become an integrated part of our mental health system. So you go to the doctor and this is a first-line option that's given to you as a potential treatment alongside antidepressants or other psychiatric medications and psychotherapy. That the medicines and therapies will achieve high remission rates, which will lead to a massive improvement in our terrible mental health statistics, and that these medicines become accessible and affordable to all Australians in need. Next slide, thank you. One of my favourite slides here. So this is really the way that psilocybin works to heal depression. So the wonderful thing about psilocybin and a number of the classic psychedelics is that they bypass what's called the default mode network of our brain, which is what keeps us stuck in quite rigid thought loops if we're suffering from a mental illness. And you can see that in the representations of fMRI scans on the right, those two circles. The one on the far right, which is a person with depression, you can see the rigid thought loops. I'm not good enough, things won't work out for me, no one loves me, I'm a failure, etc., etc. And you can see that there's not a lot of neural connections happening there. And then you have the intervention with the psilocybin in the left one, which shows this massive neurogenesis, this increase of existing neural pathways and reconnecting of neural pathways and creation of new neural pathways, increasing neuroplasticity, and allowing the patient to break out of their rigid and stuck ways of thinking. They feel this incredible sense of connection and oneness, and that empowers patients to take on their own healing so that they don't need to be popping pills daily, that they can actually start to really manage and come to terms with their particular challenge and get better and start to live a meaningful, contributing life. Next slide. So our focus is on 4 key strategic areas. We're really focused on building the entire ecosystem for these medicines to be available in Australia. And also we have various connections into the Asia Pacific as well. But we're focused on awareness and knowledge building events like tonight, webinars, a whole range of information events for practitioners, politicians, the general public, a whole range of different sectors. So watch out because we've got some amazingly good webinars and events still coming for 2020. Unfortunately, we've had to move our International Medical Summit to November 2021, but the same presenters are all confirmed, and actually we might be able to confirm some others who weren't available this year as well. So that could be a good thing. We've already sold quite a few hundred tickets, so we really encourage people to register for that because it will sell out. We also have started state and regional chapters over 25 in Australia and New Zealand. So if you're in an area where we do have a chapter and you'd like to get involved, please do. If you want to start a chapter where we don't have one, we can provide lots of information and resources to help you start a chapter with other local community leaders in your area. So please reach out. We've launched the first certificate in psychedelic assisted therapies in the Southern Hemisphere. recently, and I'm pleased to say that the first intake is full. We are on waitlist only for that, and the second intake, which is in July, is also about half full now. So if you're wanting to apply, please do so as soon as you can. We will then release intakes 3 and 4. But you know, the more that you register for these programs now, the further ahead it puts you and gives you a chance to be one of the first group of qualified psychedelic assisted therapists in Australia. We're also looking at setting up an Asia Pacific Centre for Emerging Mental Health Therapies in partnership with some universities for applied research and development, supply chains, agribusiness, looking at the manufacturing and growing of these medicines in Australia, further education, creation of jobs, because effectively this is a whole new industry for Australia and for this region. As many of you know, we've recently applied for the rescheduling of both MDMA and psilocybin, and we'll keep you posted, but our fingers and toes are all crossed for that rescheduling. And we also have set up a psychological support services area, so that provides doctors and others and patients and people using medicines with further support for integration. And we're also looking at a rollout strategy with, in partnership with a range of clinics. Again, just reminding everyone, we don't advocate for rec use, and our focus is wholly clinical. Next slide, thank you, Ilan. This is about the psychs. Oh no, Ilan, I think we're now going into Eli and thank you. So everyone, you know, once again, I'm very thrilled to present these two wonderful people. We might just get the whole gallery up and see if who actually came to part 1 of this session. If you could put up your hands if you did come to part 1, and that's why you're back at part 2. And if you didn't, that doesn't matter, because I think Patrycja will recap some of part 1 for you. So the way this will work is we'll have about a 30-minute Q&A with Patrycja interviewing Eli. And then we'd like to welcome questions from any of you. Patrycja, I'm aware of the fact that you might like to do a short meditation.
If we only have time.
Yeah, so let's see how many questions we end up with. I think, Ilan, can I just check that, are we going to stop the chat now until the end of this interview?
We are flexible, whatever gets more engagement.
What would you prefer, Patty and Eli?
I'm happy to have it on. It's actually quite lovely to interact with people.
Okay, we'll keep it on then. That's fine. So, ladies and gentlemen, very pleased to welcome back Patrycja Slawuta, who's a very accomplished person that I've had the privilege of being friends with for quite a few years now. And she's accomplished in many ways. I think I'll let her briefly introduce herself, and Dr. Eli Kotler, who is on the board of Mind Medicine Australia. He's the newest board member. He was on our advisory panel, but now he's a board member of Mind Medicine Australia, an absolute expert in trauma and addiction, really a leading, emerging and experienced psychiatrist, psychs and the psychs, psychologist, psychiatrist in Australia, and we're very grateful to have him here with us tonight on this very important webinar. So thank you both. Over to you, Patrycja and Eli.
Thank you. Thank you. It's absolute honor and pleasure to be here. This is part 2 of part 1, in a way, where you have psychologists interviewing psychiatrists, and we thought it was so lovely and there was so much interaction that there was a need to go deeper, mostly into trauma, actually. So today we'll much more focus on the trauma, and how we see it is really looking at 3 points in time: past, future, and present, and how future cannot happen unless we deal with the past, and where addiction comes into all this. We won't really touch much on psychedelics. This is mostly us discovering our expertise, our work. I'm the psychologist, Eli is the psychiatrist. But maybe what we will do first is Eli, can you summarize the 3 myths that we talked about in the previous session? Because I think they were so so groundbreaking, and it's a good refresher to understand where you come from in terms of addiction.
So yeah, I'll try to summarize what we spoke about last time very briefly, although it's obviously worth a whole discussion in itself, which was kind of the first discussion.
Which people can watch, by the way.
Yeah, you can catch up on YouTube. So the first idea we spoke about briefly was that addictions are not about pleasure. They're not about pleasure seeking. They're about avoiding pain, moving away from pain. And there is a bit of a misunderstanding of the dopamine circuit, that the dopamine is a reward circuit, but it's not a reward circuit. Dopamine is a motivational or seeking, wanting circuit, because there's a difference between wanting something and then having the pleasure of obtaining it. And dopamine is the first half. So it's incorrect that dopamine is a reward circuit, and that can lead to this misunderstanding that addictions are about pleasure when they're not. They're about avoiding pain. So that was the first important point we wanted to get across. The second one was that addictions can't be inherited, which is a really important point, because if addictions can be inherited, then people are predestined to have addictions, and there's something in their brain that makes them have addictions, so there's no way out. So first of all, that's not true. And it's important to know it's not true, because people shouldn't think that they're stuck in addictions forever. And so it's important to know that while addictions have genetic aspects to them, no one can inherit a particular addiction. That's just scientific nonsense. So if you ever hear someone saying that an addiction is inherited, you can tell them it's nonsense, and you can quote me. So the third thing we spoke about was trauma, and that in a very general sense, a traumatic experience is an experience that we don't integrate. We can't integrate it into our psyches, into our emotional worlds. And so that trauma is really something that happens outside of the person. Sorry, it happens inside of the person. It doesn't happen outside of the person. There's no event that is necessarily traumatic. It's, you know, if I as a human being can't integrate that experience, that will leave me with aspects of my psyche and emotional world that are cut off, and that essentially I end up needing to run away from. And so that's a traumatic experience for a human being. And then we spoke briefly about the way to heal from addictions is to integrate those aspects of our psyches or personalities or emotional worlds that have been cut off due to the experiences of trauma. And that's pretty much a summary of the first one.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. And so today we're going to take a slightly different take on it. We actually want to look at time frames. First of all, talk about the past and why past sometimes keeps us hostage, and why do we have to honor the past? What happened, how we related to it. I like to think about it as the secret lives that we live, because there are parts of us that in a way live secret lives. There was a book once, The Secret Life of Bees, and it was about like how bees live, but we have the same. There are secret parts of ourselves that kind of, you know, are at the bottom of brainstem, if you wish, that had to survive in the childhood, and they live their own little secret life. And sometimes we catch ourselves seeing them, but it's almost like trying to catch one's own tail. We can only see it in the shadow. And so I'm really curious on your take on past. Why some people cannot just move on, and how does it relate to addiction?
Yes, it's a super important point. I work in a framework in the hospital I work in. It's very trauma focused and trauma based, and people don't actually, even though it's on the website, people don't always actually realize that when they come in. And then all of a sudden, when people realize we're talking to them about their childhoods, the most common question I get is, why do we have to talk about this? Like it's in the past. Well, what are we doing here? Let's just treat my addiction. And so it's a really, really important point. It's also, unfortunately, a very sad point, I think, that we can't leave the past in the past, because the past is not in the past. The past is in the present. And it's just that we don't necessarily make the connections, and sometimes we need people to help us make the connections. It's amazing how many times I've seen someone come in, I've spoken to someone with an addiction who had a traumatic childhood and they're a heroin addict, but they've never actually connected the two. They thought they were totally disconnected. They didn't realize. And this is, Patty, what you're talking about, that it hides. You know, most of all, it hides from us. You know, our past hides from us within our, you know, behind our personality and emotional patterns and justifications and rationalizations. And so it really hides from us. And so when someone asks me, why can't I leave the, you know, past in the past, I sort of challenge them to potentially see that their past isn't in the past, that they're reliving their past constantly. And that's for them to work out. You know, I could say it, but until they see it, you know, it's not up to me to convince them of that. You know, they people can see it in themselves. It's just a painful journey.
When we were chatting before, I think you made an interesting distinction about trauma, which, you know, maybe we can define trauma also, because, you know, there's the trauma with the capital T and then the trauma with the little t, if you wish. And, you know, some psychiatrists would claim most of us have experienced in some way the trauma in little t, which is, you know, somebody shamed us, abandoned us, betrayed us at some point in the past or even recently. But you also mentioned that, you know, the trauma when it comes to adults is usually people come and know exactly what happened. And they say, you know, there was an abuse, or, you know, I had a car accident, I got raped, or whatever that was. I witnessed something that was just so overwhelming to my system that, you know, it froze in a way. From my perspective, trauma is a frozenness in a nervous system. It's actually nervous system response. But then you said also that the childhood trauma that happened, that very often people don't even necessarily remember, is the one that really hides, right? So the adult trauma is kind of, people can see it and kind of come with it and show it to you and put it on the table. Whereas the childhood one is so hard to spot because it's also interwoven within the fabric of the psyche, and it becomes integral part of the psyche because of the intelligence of the system, right? When you have a tree and then there's barbed wire, whatever, the tree grows around it. Does the tree know that there's barbed wire inside it? Potentially not. Can you elaborate on that a little bit from what you've seen?
Yeah, so we were talking about this, and it is a really important difference. Adult trauma we have as adults, you know, people present to the GP, the therapist, the psychiatrist as traumatized. So they will present with the trauma. Developmental, you know, I'm having nightmares, flashbacks. I literally can't escape it. It's in my face all the time. It's in my body. I cannot get rid of it. Developmental trauma presents with the secondary. The system has adapted, as you're saying, like a tree. The system will adapt. It will adapt internally through defense mechanisms, which literally shape our personality and create things like so-called personality disorders, which is a terrible name for that, whatever that thing is. But anyway, which is really, you know, personality. I mean, this is what a personality disorder, according to DSM, this is what a personality disorder is. It's the mind's way. It's an intelligent design. It shouldn't be called a disorder, just like addiction should not necessarily be called a disease, because it's actually a solution, and it's a very good solution because it's literally kept the person alive. They probably would have killed themselves without the addiction or without the defense mechanisms that twist and distort the personality. And the distortions in the personality and the behaviors, so either internal or external. Internally, you know, which technically they're called defense mechanisms, and the external ones are called coping mechanisms, like addictions. The trauma hides behind those internal and external mechanisms. So the people they don't present as traumatized. No one presents by saying that my mummy neglected me when I was 3 to 5 because she had postnatal depression and she couldn't connect with me emotionally. No one says that. They present with chronic depression or personality styles which are unhealthy. And so the presentation, which is the symptom, which is the intelligence of the system. As you're saying, the system has developed like a tree to protect the person and keep them alive. And the person will present with the result of the trauma, which is the protection. So the symptom is often actually the protective mechanism that they have developed. And so that's a very significant difference between adult trauma and developmental trauma, which means that the treatments are very different. Because whilst with adult trauma, the treatment can be exposure therapy and because they know what the trauma is. With developmental trauma, a big part of the treatment is trying to help the person realize that they were traumatized, which is a very difficult thing because none of us want to think about these things and feel these things. So yeah, so there's these, the system, I think the tree, I really like the tree analogy. A tree will grow to where there's, Eric Fromm uses the same analogy, so you're in good company. So the tree will grow to where there's sun. The tree will literally twist and just, this is what he said, the tree will distort itself to get to the sun because the sun is keeping it alive. A little person, their heart will distort and twist to get the, any love and attention they can get, even if it's from someone that abuses them, because that's their oxygen and that's their sunshine.
Yeah, and I think what I've seen, at least from trauma perspective in psychology, is that reframing from honoring the intelligence of the system, or how the system or how the little human had to survive. It is such a beautiful kind of honoring of, as opposed to saying this is a problem and this is really screwed up, is actually saying, look how intelligent the system was that it developed those solutions versus that I have this problem. And for what I've seen, creating that space allows for integration, creates kind of bigger container for all that parts that were disowned, frozen, shut down and put somewhere in the closet, to very slowly open the door and say, well, actually, maybe potentially I'm welcome here. And then the parts can sit at the table, which is precisely the integration that we've been talking about. Both on kind of psychological, but also we also know on nervous system level, brain level.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important point you make for a few reasons. I think it is, first of all, it's destigmatizing for people. No one, if anyone has met people with addictions, they hate themselves more than society hates them. They hate themselves more than anybody. And if you can help someone appreciate that their mind is protecting them, that they're not stupid and they're not bad and they're not morally corrupt, that they're actually, the mind has protected them from something very painful, that can be really destigmatizing for the person. And that can be very significant for self-esteem, for someone to realize that I'm not just a stupid person with no willpower, that my mind is doing this for a reason. So that's one reason it's very important. Another reason it's very, very important is because it reframes how we understand mental illness, including addiction. It reframes mental illness into something that makes sense. Because if symptoms make sense, if symptoms are there for a reason, if the tree has twisted in a particular way to get to the sun, that means that the symptoms that are presenting actually make sense and they're there for a reason. And because we're very clever humans, we're kind of dumb, but we're also pretty clever in some ways, we can actually understand it. And if we can understand the system and the intelligence of the design in ourselves, that can not only be destigmatizing, but it can be a way out of these patterns that get stuck in the neurons, as you're saying. It is literally in the neurons. We know this. We know this is fact now. This is not some fantastic story. We know that our experiences literally shape the connections in the brain. I was listening to someone today saying that in adolescence, we lose 30,000 connections in our brain. I think it was every second. I don't know. Maybe don't.
The brain literally wires itself in adolescence. Yeah.
It's like literally shaped by our experiences, and we know this. Particularly powerfully by emotional experiences. And we have particularly powerful emotional experiences when our needs are not met, which goes back to what you're saying. that it is an amazing system. It's an amazing system that our mind has developed the ability to survive despite not getting our needs met. And I mean, this is what trauma is. We don't get our needs met, even worse than that sometimes. And our mind can literally, we don't necessarily just die. Our mind will just twist and distort to get to the sun, like the tree, which is an amazing intelligence. It's amazing that we don't just die. We actually keep living despite, as humans, we can live despite not getting our needs met, which is remarkable.
Right, so we don't get our needs met, and then the system finds something else that will meet that need, whether that be, and that's where it starts being compulsive addiction, right? Because as you said, it fills the hole but doesn't fulfill it in a way, right? And from that perspective, moving on, how does it reflect on the future? We know from research, there's beautiful research done at Harvard saying that, you know, in order to create future, the brain simulates the past. And so what seems to be, that's why we can't really leave the past, because if the past is repetitive, there's no place for a new future to come in, especially if the basic needs are not being met. They're just being met with substitutes. Can you talk about how does addiction shape future, or does not allow for new future or new possibilities to even come in?
Yeah, I mean, as you're saying, it's actually a really interesting area because it's where sort of neuroscience and sort of older ideas like psychoanalytic ideas really start converging. It's a very interesting area. But as you're saying, we know now that the brain is literally a prediction machine. The brain will predict what's going to happen. It doesn't necessarily see what's happening. We know now that the conscious experience we have is a very, very small part of our minds, very, very small. All the predictive work is going on underneath. It's all predictions. And we will interpret the world through these predictions. So in other words, it used to be some weird Freudian idea that we just, we see what we want to see and there's a psychic reality that isn't real reality and they're different and all. But now we know it scientifically. We know that we see what our mind predicts rather than reality. And so on. And if people want to look up, there's something called the Bayesian Brain. And if people are interested in this type of stuff, and there's a psychiatrist and physicist called Carl Friston, who is very big into these things, free energy principle and Bayesian brain, if people are interested in that sort of stuff. But yeah, we do know now that the brain predicts. It doesn't see reality. It sees what it's seen in the past, and it sees reality through the lens of the past, because our past is literally wired into our brain. And so that can be looked at from a neuroscientific perspective, as we've been talking about. But from, more psychological or psychoanalytic ideas, it's about, I mean, it's interesting because Freud pointed out this idea of repetition compulsion, that we compulsively repeat our past. Again, the problem is that we don't realize it because it's hidden, but we all compulsively repeat our past. And when you look at it from a psychological perspective, because we are also meaning-making machines, so these things mean something to us. And so someone who had an abusive relationship with their father, but they also loved their father because they were their father, so they needed their father's love, but the father also abused them. So that person is 100% more likely to repeat that pattern. And so then the question is why? So we have neuroscientific reasons, but then there are also meaningful reasons that people can actually connect to in themselves if they're brave enough to look at it. For example, maybe I'm still looking for my dad to love me because I wasn't loved how I wanted to love, or how I wanted to be loved. So I keep looking and I keep trying to fix it, even though it never gets fixed. And so from a psychological perspective, we can have these ideas as well that actually mean something to us and we can connect to on a human level rather than just to know that my brain does it, because my brain does do it. But also it can mean something to me as a human in my search for whatever I'm searching for that I didn't get, that need that wasn't met.
So how do we get out of this pickle, right? Compulsive repeat of the past, future that cannot really come in because there's really no space for it because all the wheels are turning compulsively. We know the healing happens in the present. Can you speak about that a little bit? what are the ingredients of healing?
It brings me to something that I should have said just before when we just in the last question. If you think about what distorts our views of the world, in a very significant way, it's our emotions. We view the world through our through an emotional lens. If I feel, if my fear circuits are triggered, I'm going to start thinking that people don't like me, and that may be reliving something from my past, because I am reliving something from my past. This person has reminded me of my father or mother that didn't like me, and so now my fear circuit has been triggered, just like a rat's fear circuit will be triggered, that gets generalized through conditioning. And so, us humans, we have the same brains, and so I might meet someone that unconsciously reminds me of my dad. So all of a sudden my fear circuit has been triggered, and all of a sudden I think this person doesn't like me and I'm scared of them. It's because they remind me of my dad, even though I'm not consciously aware of that. So we really, emotions, and we could talk about emotions for hours, but emotions are very significant aspects to what colors our perception of the world and how we perceive the world. And because of that, it can, one very useful way to, what you said is 100% correct, first of all, you don't need me to tell you that, but just to step back a bit to what you said, that it's in the here and now. It's right now in the present where the healing happens. So there's the past where it comes from, there's my future, which has stagnated and is destined to repeat itself. But then there is the present, and it's the present where I can start to heal and understand myself. And I think there's a big connection between healing and understanding ourselves. I think they seem to happen together. One of the things we spoke about, and that I guess is a very significant concern for me as a psychiatrist and as a human being, is the degree to how much our society has disconnected from our emotions, our feelings. And we discussed a great quote by Charles Darwin the other day, who actually spoke about this even in his time. And in fact, we've become so disconnected from our emotional world that we often label our emotions as mental illnesses. I end up having to almost deprogram people, because I can ask them, how are you feeling? And they'll say, that's my depression, which is an interesting insight into our society, because what it means is that we've taken our emotional experiences and made them objects or things that they're not part of me, let alone being a very important and special part of me. They're not even part of me. So it's like I have depression, I have an anxiety disorder, as opposed to I feel fear all the time, or I feel stuck in my emotions. I have these awful sad emotions that I don't know what to do with. So, we've become, as a society, I think we've become so disconnected from our emotional worlds and feelings that we don't even realize that we've pathologized feelings. They are pathological in many ways because they are overwhelming and I might kill myself because of them. But we've really become alienated from our emotional worlds, including myself, for sure.
Yeah, so that's really interesting because, you work with addiction. I actually work with high performance. So Red Bull folks and, really C-suite executives, et cetera, et cetera. And, but it doesn't really matter. I feel the question I always ask is, what is the capacity of your nervous system? How much can your nervous system handle? Because it boils down to the capacity of the nervous system. And if somebody is more poetic, it's the capacity of the heart. How stable can your heart be? Because it turns out our heart is quite powerful and quite grand, right? It can hold a lot. And, people always say, how do you train resilience? Resilience is, from my perspective, how we meet the moment. And we get trained moment to moment to moment to no moment, right? I may be triggered by you right now, and how I relate to it, it can cause me trauma, right? I can be like, whoa, he disagreed with me, or he quoted Freud and I completely, right? Well, whatever it is, or somebody rolled their eyes on me, or somebody laughed, or mean comment, right? And it can be immediately can be traumatic to me. Or I can meet the moment and say, okay, I am triggered right now. Why am I triggered? Blah, blah, blah. Which is literally how moment to moment to moment we train our nervous system, and we build the capacity, the buffer system of the psyche, not only of the psyche, but also of the nervous system. And I think we agree on that this comes very, very handy when it comes to, you know, integrating, because there's this space for those parts, and especially those emotions to come in. Which I call it, how do we meet the moment? Because I actually think we meet the moment and then we can mine the moment. And so there's such a richness from, you know, be here now. You just mentioned that. I mean, this is, you know, quite old quote. And yet by far this summarizes every single therapy practice, at least embodied therapy practice around trauma that I've seen. Being able to be with what is, which very often is something emotional. Yeah,
and I'd like to, pick up on a couple of those points, because you said something, you know, in AA, NA, and in anonymous groups, I say living life on its own terms, which is exactly the same idea. Yeah, I need to learn how to live life on its terms. So when life happens, if I can learn to live with that, feel it, experience it, then maybe I won't have an addiction anymore, because I'll be able to live life on its own terms, which I think is exactly what you're saying. But it comes from the addiction field, but exactly the same idea. I mean, it's the same idea because it's the truth. You know, people can just, you know, different groups find the same truth and they put different words on it. The way one of the counselors in my hospital put it, which I thought was also I guess a pithy way to say it, is they said, if it's hysterical, it's historical. So in other words, if I can't meet the, well, there's my daughter's alarm clock going off, I'll turn that on. If I can't meet the present, why can't I? Because it's always easy to say, you know, I always think, you know, people say like mindfulness is great, do mindfulness. And mindfulness is awesome. But there are a massive proportion of the population that cannot be mindful because I literally just can't sit with myself. So, you know, thanks for telling me for me to be mindful. It's great. Mindfulness is awesome. Meditation is awesome, but I can't sit for myself. I can't sit with myself for a second, you know? And so when things are hysterical, when things are too much, when things are too big, they're too big for my heart, I need to start to understand why. Where does it come from? If it's hysterical, it's historical. It's going to come from somewhere in my part because again, the system makes sense. We're not random. We don't have random, you know, some people can't sit with guilt, some with shame, some with anger, some with abandonment, some with rejection, some with shame. It's not going to be random. It's not going to be like my mind is shooting up random feelings and it's all crazy, you know, there's going to be some sense to it because the system makes sense. If we had, I mean, going back to what you said before, I think if we had more faith in the system of our minds, you know, I think that would be potentially a big step forward for how we treat mental illness, rather than just trying to get rid of the symptoms or, you know, somehow to actually understand the system, the symptoms, because if the system makes sense, then the symptoms must make sense. The big feelings I'm getting now must be from somewhere. You know, like I was seeing, it just reminds me of someone I saw a couple of days ago who had a very traumatic childhood experiences. And she suggested to me that she'd worked through it all, you know, like, you know, the past is in the past, kind of what we were saying before. And yet monthly, she has these really, really scary, dark feelings. Like it creeped me out being in the room with her, having her describe the feelings. And she's been diagnosed with, you know, perimenstrual dysphoric disorder. I can't even remember the name. I don't know the DSM that well, you know. And so
and it
she
changes.
kept saying, sorry?
And it changes, the DSM changes.
Yeah, it changes every year. I can't keep up. So she kept saying to me, so I would ask her about these feelings, what are they? You know, because to me, they're for sure related to her trauma in the past. They're parts of her trauma that she hasn't been able to work through. But for her, they're PMDD, you know, and so if we respected the system, that the system makes sense and it doesn't send up random signals and feelings and chemicals, then maybe she could, or maybe she would have the idea that maybe I can start sitting with these and, like you're saying, start to increase my capacity to sit with these feelings, increase the size of my heart through relationships with other people and creating safe spaces to actually sit with the feelings, rather than sort of alienating these emotional experiences by putting labels on them and names and getting rid of them and being disconnected from them. Yeah, that's what came to my mind.
Yeah, so I guess final piece, because right, so some people cannot. It's too hard, it's too painful. There's a lot of, and I know you run groups as well, there's a lot of work around witnessing, right, and holding the space with somebody, co-regulation of the nervous systems. How important is that, especially when it comes to, you know, deep trauma that's like hides itself within the system?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's...
Because I think that ties into psilocybin and many other psychedelic experiences, because it feels like it's being witnessed.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. It's the safety. I mean, I think, you know, it was Erik Erikson that put trust and mistrust as the basis of human experience. You know, mistrust is fear, you know, it's trust and fear. To create a space for someone where they feel safe, first of all, it's an art and it's a skill. I hope people appreciate that. People, you know, and therapists out, whoever's listening, you'll appreciate that it's a challenge. It's because you have to be very present. You can't fake a relationship. Trust will not build trust won't form if the relationship is not true. So to build a space for someone to feel safe in is a work. It requires effort on behalf of the person. I mean, on both people sitting there or in the group, it requires an effort. But that safe space, I mean, it always reminds me of a mummy and a baby, you know, where like if I'm in a group and someone's being real and authentic and everyone's connected, you can feel the connection, you can feel it's a safe space. And it always reminds me of, you know, the person opening up as the baby and the group or the person listening as the mummy, and the baby feels safe. So the baby can, you know, can start to regulate itself. And it's true. I mean, it's a fact, it happens. And there is science around it now, as you said, and Alan Shaw writes a lot about it, the right brain to right brain communications. And, you know, there is actually, I mean, we know it to be true. Often science just comes up to back up what we already know to be true in our own experience. But that safe space is tremendously, I mean, it's necessary. Without it, it just won't happen. Yeah, and I mean, there's something obviously built into us from a very primitive part of us as babies. You know, mummy comes to hold me and I feel safe, and then I can regulate myself. Yeah.
Simone de Beauvoir said the human attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. And it goes both in giving and receiving it, right? Giving somebody attention, which I think is really the crux of therapy, but also being able to receive it. And which I always, you know, some of us struggle with that, receiving attention, loving attention and presence, somebody else's presence. So,
yeah,
but I also believe that's one of the primary things that actually is this magic that is, you know, that's what builds the structure of magic, where it literally starts rewiring the nervous system for trust.
Yes.
Yeah.
I do just want to say one thing though, that I do think that it's necessary, the connection and safe holding is necessary, but I think it's also, there is a cognitive aspect to these things as well, because often people require interpretations, because again, because the trauma hides, we often need someone else to point it out to us. Like, why do you think that? Why are you feeling that right now? Why are you doing that? Because we will always have rationalizations that will justify our own actions and feelings and behaviors. And rationalizations are the lies that we tell ourselves to justify, you know, our things that come from an emotional place. We justify them rationally. I mean, I'll just give a quick example so people can connect to the idea. Someone can be sitting in group therapy, and they're obviously very scared because they're shaking and they're closed and their legs are shaking. And I might ask them after they've been quiet for 45 minutes, why haven't you said anything? And they might say, because I don't have anything interesting to say. Now, to me, it's obvious that they haven't spoken because they're scared. but the rationalization comes up to their head that they haven't said anything because they don't have anything to say, nothing important to say. Now they believe that, they really think it's the truth. They don't see their fear because their fear is hidden. They don't realize that the real reason they're not opening up is because they're scared. They think they believe their lie. So I need to make an interpretation at that point. I need to say to them, well, it's interesting because you kind of look scared to me. I wonder if it has something to do with fear. And so then they can start to realize, oh, actually I am scared. And then the emotional work starts. So, okay, so you're scared. So, and then the holding begins and the emotional work begins. But it's often the interpretation is very important in the beginning. And I think people really need both.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. I think given the time constraints, we can open for Q&A, well, for the questions, if there are any comments, etc., etc. I think I'm going to give it to you, Tania, to kind of moderate.
Potentially, if anyone has any questions, they could write them on the...
Yeah, that too.
Or alternatively, we could just keep talking for hours.
We can just keep on going, yeah.
It is maybe while it gets set up, or it might be just interesting, I guess, to mention what you mentioned before about psychedelics. Just as a little link, because I guess the idea with psychedelics is that it facilitates therapy. It's not just having trips, it's actually having experiences that can allow us to gain deeper experiences of ourselves. And that certainly MDMA seems to work by making us feel safe, which is the trust, which is the holding, and almost like mummy's holding me, so I have a secure base from where to explore myself and explore the world rather than be shut down.
Yeah, I think Gabor Mate was talking about one of his books, The Anatomy of the Hungry Ghost. He talks about, especially people in Vancouver who shoot themselves up with, I want to say heroin, but I actually think it's heroin. And he said it's when they shoot themselves up, first of all, it stimulates the same brain regions as, for attachment, but they actually said it's a liquid hug, right? So that shoot feels like a liquid hug that they're getting, which is just so interesting. Do you get that a lot? That when people what they actually seek is that love and acceptance, which we know MDMA, ayahuasca, and many others actually, other substances, they actually bring that experience.
Yes, and it raises a very, very, very significant issue, which in terms of how I understand addictions, which is that the chemicals that we get addicted to, I mean, as we've discussed, we can get addicted to anything, but particularly the chemicals which are so highly addictive, it's important to think about in terms of understanding addictions that they hook into evolutionarily preserved circuits that are already in the brain. So these circuits are in the brain. So these circuits are already doing something. And it's important to look at what the circuits are doing, because that can help us understand what the addiction is. We know that the opiate circuit is involved in attachment and love and social connection. We know that. And so when baby monkey gets hugged by mummy monkey, if it hasn't seen mummy monkey in a bit, the endogenous opiates will go off. You don't have to be a genius to work out then what a heroin or an opiate addiction is about. Because if that circuit is about feeling loved and special and validated and warm and connected and safe, if that's what that circuit does, it's not a very big jump to realize that people with opiate addictions are probably medicating painful disconnection and grief, usually from childhood. So it raises a really interesting question about what addictions are and how to understand them based on the circuitry that they trigger. And yes, 100%. I don't think I've met an opiate addict who ever learned properly how to have a loving relationship.
Yeah, which is, you know, just maybe final quote from Gabor Mate, because we all love his work. The question is not why the behavior, but why the pain. And really, and so many of us do not have the capacity to sit with that pain. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we can work with people, is actually little by little increasing that pain. I mean, people get addicted to painkillers, and very often, you know, and being in US and actually seeing that horrendous carnage that opioids are doing and that epidemic is doing. Very often it's not physical pain, it's psychological pain. And we know that actually the brain does not distinguish. It's the same neural circuits that are responsible for physical pain and for psychological emotional pain, especially when it comes to rejection. And so this is really where the mind and body starts intertwining. And so are we medicating our body? Are we actually medicating our psychology and our psyche? Because the barbed wire, we don't even see, you know, somebody actually mentioned that the barbed wire metaphor is quite interesting, but the barbed wire is still barbed wire, right? It still potentially cuts, it still potentially hurts, even though it's like within the tree. And so, yeah, I think this is a lot of people, especially now in the trauma work, they're saying, you know, a lot of that stuff that shows itself physically is actually psychosocial political issues as well. You know, years of oppression and repression and repressed emotions, both of, you know, you actually did mention, you know, that the emotion. There's actually a very interesting book, Mad, Bad, and Sad, about medicalization of female emotions. Women were called mad, bad, or sad, and then you look at the, you know, the prescribed drugs for different female emotions, and you know, they're you know, our emotions get very heavily medicated. And so that all kind of really gets complex and intertwined, but actually in a way it's very, very simple, right? When you look to the root, again, not why the behavior, but why the pain.
And it says a lot about the society we live in, which seems to run away. I mean, we all do it. We're all guilty in a way, because we're all part of this society, you know. I run away from pain, so, you know.
Cool. I think we have a whole bunch of questions.
We do. So Patrycja, would you like to pick a couple out? Because
no, please go ahead.
No, well, I dropped out, so I didn't actually, unfortunately, I had to restart and I've not got all the questions. So do you want to pick a couple out to begin with?
Okay, sure. Difficult, well, I'm gonna pick the first one that I see. Difficult to know exactly how to ask this question, though the tree and barbed wire metaphor really helps. Do you think we can be born with a barbed wire already in place?
Look, there is evidence, you know, that the experience of children in the womb, you know, fetuses in the womb has some effect, certainly. One thing that I really, really believe, though, is that, and I truly do believe this, I mean, we must be born with something, you know, like you think about it, addictions are partly genetic. They're not caused by genes, but they're partly genetic. So then the question is, well, what's inherited? So what are we born with? Is it possible that, I mean, first of all, no one knows. That's a question that no one knows what the genetic aspect of addiction actually is, which is important to realize that we're not clever enough to know that yet. But for example, could some people be born emotionally more sensitive than other human beings? So I think the answer is probably yes. Maybe I, as a child, had an experience that for someone else wouldn't have been traumatic, but for me, you know, the guilt and shame I felt was so intense that my little heart had to shut that down, and that was left as a little barb in there, and my personality twisted and distorted around that. And my sister or brother, who wasn't so emotionally sensitive, didn't get that barb because they didn't feel it so intensely, so they didn't have to cope, they didn't have to deal with that a very painful emotion. So, you know, we
Now I have access, by the way. Sorry to interrupt you.
sorry.
I was just saying now I have access to the questions.
Okay,
Sorry.
great. Awesome. So, you know, we can be born with, you know, what we're born with that predisposes us to all types of mental illness and pain and suffering. I don't think anyone actually, I've never seen evidence for what it actually is. I certainly think that it might have something to do with being emotionally sensitive, which is certainly not a negative thing. You know, it's almost like a superpower if it could be used for the good.
Exactly.
But I don't believe that we're born. I mean, unless there's an obvious neurological problem or damage, you know, I don't think we're born damaged. I mean, I think, again, it comes back to the intelligence of the system. Mother Nature seems to do a pretty amazing job. I think it's, you know, it's humans, it's us that kind of screw it up, I think. I don't know.
Cool. Next question.
So there's quite a lot. Yeah, I've got a lot of questions here that I want to reel off. And can we do the speed questioning, speed answering? So if we ask the questions, then either Patty or Eli can answer, ideally not both, so that we get through more of the questions. Would that be okay?
Sure.
Patty, did you have one more you wanted to read out?
Well, I think the one that asks about the importance of the therapist in the psychedelic treatment, as opposed to just taking it and hoping it will do a remedial job.
Absolutely.
I mean, I've seen it, you know, New York, San Francisco, Silicon Valley, everybody's taking it. And it becomes like a party drug, and, you know, people get their downloads. I would say in some way it contributes to actually spiritual bypassing. Which is a term coined by some actually spiritual teachers who say, you know, you just get those downloads and really nothing happens with it. And so what Eli was talking about, I think the idea that then asking question why and what's going on for you and kind of diving deeper and grounding that experience is a very, very important one. Otherwise, it's just another, you know, I would say spiritual masturbation in a way, because that's how it feels sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
You want to, do you just want to comment on that, Eli?
No, I mean, I would just say more of what you're saying. So.
Okay, cool. Next question for you.
I'll ask this question here. Could we do this within an intergenerational trauma framework?
Sorry, Tanya, could you say it again?
I mean, you've already done
You have bad reception.
Could we consider this within the intergenerational trauma framework?
Yeah, I can see the question. I like the quote above that, by the way. I think that's great.
Fantastic.
I mean, well, intergenerational trauma, you know, it's really a really significant thing. And again, you know, look at us as a society, we have such, we don't get it. You know, we don't get it. We look at people, you know, we look at cultures that have been displaced and are having problems, and, you know, I don't think we get it. And coming from, I guess, you know, a family that does have intergenerational trauma, myself, you know, I can see it. I mean, I guess I'm struggling with the question because could we consider this? I'm not exactly sure what that means. I mean, I guess, you know, I mean, just what's coming to my mind, because, you know, intergenerational trauma, I can work with the intergenerational trauma exists. It's real. It gets passed on. I don't believe there has to be a genetic aspect to intergenerational trauma. I see intergenerational trauma as being passed on through developmental experiences.
Correct. I want to actually speak to that as well.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, because, you know, I believe both of us share common background where there's actually you know, trauma in the past, and I just want to quote somebody who's a therapist in New York City, Esther Perel, who you know, was born in Antwerp to Holocaust survivor parents, and she said, you know, as she looked as a, you know, young kid, among the people who survived and came out of the camps. And she said there were two groups of people, ones that survived, and the second group was the ones that came back to life. And I think the capacity of the nervous system and the mind to come back to life versus not only survive, later on was a developmental thing that shaped the next generations. Now, was that passed through genes? Potentially, but that's also like, did the mind manage to cope with things and not only survive, because we survive, but come back to life as a fully capable human being who can actually raise another family and healthy children, secure attachment. So I think it's more on the individual side than probably more collective. Yeah.
There is something else I just also want to add, and this is such a big thing. I think trauma is intergenerational trauma. I haven't seen one person come through the hospital that I work that had trauma that I don't doubt their parents were traumatized. I have no doubt in the world that their parents were traumatized. I mean, I think trauma is intergenerational, because if I was traumatized as a child, I mean, there could be something external coming from outside of my family. So just excluding cases like that, most people that have developmental trauma, it happens within the family. If it happens within the family, it's going to be intergenerational trauma for sure, which brings up a really, really significant issue of blame. Because it's really, something I really have to speak to people about a lot, people who are trying to understand their childhoods, is that it's about understanding their parents. It's not about blaming their parents. Some people have a massive resistance to go into their childhood because it's about blame. I don't want to blame my parents for that. They did the best they could. But two things are always true, pretty much always. One, my parents tried the best they could, and two, they screwed me up. And both of those things are usually true. And so it's not about blame, it's about sort of understanding my parents and their trauma and what happened to them, because that allows me to forgive them and to move past blame to forgiveness and to understand this intergenerational thing that happens.
It's absolutely beautiful from both of you. And just to give some context for those of you on the webinar, that all three of us are Jewish. And so all three of us, based on the comments then, would have experienced intergenerational trauma because we were born into families who experienced the Holocaust. So we need access to these medicines, I guess. I will go back now to some of the other questions here. Just very quick answers, really quick answers now. What if depression is in fact a form of grief for our own lives not being as they should? What if it is a form of grief for the connections we have lost yet still need? That's from Johann Hari, that quote. It's a great quote. Just a quick answer on that one.
Freud said depression is about loss. He said it over 100 years ago. I have no doubt that a lot of depression is about loss and grief.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and somebody else, I just, on that grief, somebody said is a love that cannot find a place to land. And I thought that was really beautiful because it falls down to love again. And that need to be and feel accepted and give love.
It's fantastic, thank you. Next one, just let me see. I answered that one. What about addiction and traumatic brain injury? Do they work in the same way that can be revisited and linked to a certain point in time? Do you think it's treatable in the same way? Often people can't have the insight. Wondering your thoughts.
Yeah, that's tricky. Some acquired brain injury leads to impulsivity. Impulsivity that has nothing to do with, if someone doesn't have a brain injury and they're impulsive, to me, that means they have overwhelming emotions. And so that's an emotional issue that they can work through. And, once their heart sort of grows and they can have a space to sit with the emotions, they won't be so impulsive anymore. There are brain injuries that lead to impulsivity. To try and to try and treat that with an emotional type of therapy would probably be pointless and wasting the person's time. And so sometimes people do need medications, I think, that can help with impulsivity. Sometimes people need much more behavioral strategies, much more behavioral focus in treatment, because the insight and emotional work is not necessarily going to help them, because, it's like someone who is developing dementia and becomes impulsive. You can try and do therapy, insight-oriented emotional working, therapy with them, but it's probably not going to help because they're actually developing dementia. And so then in those cases, I think the treatment does have to be a little bit different and potentially focus more on medication and behavioral strategies. But at the same time, it's also, I think, really important to not, the mistake can also be made to assume that this person, because they have an acquired brain injury, their impulsivity is due to the biological insult on the brain. They may also be able to work through a whole lot of stuff from their childhood. They may still, at the end of the process, be more impulsive than the next person because of their brain injury. So, I still think that both treatment modalities need to be held and worked through, but perhaps a focus on medication and behavioral strategies.
Okay, and last couple of quick questions. There is an interrelationship with readiness to integrate feelings and what was in denial and making intervention such as you look at it. Will Eli comment about whether readiness to integrate a psychedelic is the same readiness as being ready to listen to that type of observation from a therapist?
I'm going to be totally honest and say that I don't have enough experience administering psychedelics to people. So I can't answer that question because I don't know the answer.
Patty, did you want to comment at all on that one?
Sorry, you were cutting in and I actually could not really hear the question, but I've seen, therapy assisted NDMA sessions, and they've been quite remarkable. But people that go in, they're going not for 1 hour, but that's very often like entire day. I feel there's certain type of readiness for this type of experience because it can literally shake the entire world. And the psyche kind of disassembles, and then the therapist kind of helps to assemble it. So I think it's just a different experience. And the therapists I've seen that work with MDMA, they take it very seriously. With great power comes great responsibility. So this is not to be treated lightly.
Okay, thank you. Eli, there's a question there about bipolar. It's not relevant particularly to today's theme, but did you want to answer it? It's the one that says, hang on a second. Do psychiatrists ever feel safe enough to suggest to their patients try and live without the medications they've been taking for, let's say, 3 years, e.g. Seroquel, etc.? When is it safe enough to take a patient off?
Okay. It's a really, really awesome question. And the question is great. And it needs to be done sometimes. I am fortunate in the sense that I work in a hospital with people who are there for a month. So I do that, but I know they're safe because there are nurses and doctors there. I have done it with people out in the community, but only when, we both agree on it and there's a really, safe plan, and they're getting checked on regularly. It also, it's a hard question to answer because it depends. If someone has had massive mood swings, by the way, bipolar as well, I don't see that as different to any other. It's emotions. It's all emotions if you think about it. But yeah, look, the short answer is yes. And I think it's a really great thing to try if you've particularly been stable for a while. I do it a lot, but again, I work in hospital. So I think it's a really great thing to be able to do because it allows people to be faced with whatever's underneath that they've been medicating. And again, I think that's part of the healing process, to be able to face whatever's down there and to be able to sit with it and start to process it and understand it. And the medications are effective, like they do often work, which means that they're going to cut off those feelings. And so it's hard to do, and it may be hard to do a lot of emotional work when the medications are keeping it down. So I think the short answer is yes, but a lot of psychiatrists probably don't do it.
And just one last one, you've been talking a lot about this also, but so there's questions, I'll just amalgamate them. How do we break the chain of this intergenerational trauma? And why do some people repeat the trauma their parents inflicted on them while others learn and treat their own children better?
I can just talk from psychological perspective. Awareness, very often we're just not aware. It is the source code that is covered on top of many, many other things. And so, we get those imprints very early on, and we see what love is and this is how love is expressed. This is how you raise children. This is what you do when you get angry with children. And so very often we don't even realize that this is the water we're swimming in. So awareness is the first one. The second one is acceptance, and I really think understanding that this played a role, and then comes the change. And I've seen quite a few people saying, this ends with me, and this is honestly where people take the responsibility and make that gap between the stimulus and response a little bit bigger when they actually have that emotional flexibility to say, this is what I always have done. I'm gonna do not A. Even if the B is kind of silly and makes no sense, then so I would say trauma very often freezes and fractures and flattens the scope of possibility. And there's only one possibility of doing things. And the brain doesn't even consider that there's other ways of dealing with things. And so it's finding that wiggle room to do things differently, even though that the other difference is maybe not the perfect one, but it's still different. So it starts creating new neural pathways.
Yeah, I would agree 100%. And I would just add that it just, how is intergenerational trauma stopped? It takes one very brave person with the resources around them to get the help they need.
Wonderful. And I think to conclude, I like this question here. Any comments on being able to love and appreciate your shadows when one does find the ability to realize them?
I actually think our greatest power is also our kryptonite. And so, can the obstacle in the way become the way? Some of the best healers, and you actually talk to the people who are therapists or psychiatrists or even artists, they walk through the pain in a way. And so I actually think there's so much to mine in the shadow. Joseph Campbell said that the cave we fear to enter holds the treasure we seek. And so what are potentially the treasures that are in it? And I think that's where ghost turns into genie, if we're actually willing to go in there. But few people do.
And I might just add that if you're a person that when they, some people, when they see their faults, they get very upset by them and very self-critical. I would then just suggest that self-criticism is one of the faults that hasn't been looked at, because actually we shouldn't actually be self-critical when we see a fault, because if we really understand it, we'll realize it comes from somewhere. So if I'm being self-critical when I see my faults, all that would mean to me is that the self-criticism is a fault that you haven't understood properly.
Wonderful. Eli, just another question here from Nicolina, who says, I'm interested in why aren't more psychiatrists interested in exploring these medicines with their clients? I mean, obviously there's the illegal aspect at the moment, but what would it take, do you think, for psychiatrists? I mean, you've been wonderful to work with and you're on our board and everything, and we're enormously grateful to you and many other psychiatrists who are part of our advisory panels and others. But what do you think it's going to take for psychiatrists to really embrace innovation in treatment going forward?
I would like to blame society rather than psychiatry. I think there's a broader issue. What would it take? So psychiatrists are part of society. We live in a particular society that views emotional difficulties in a particular way. And what would it take for us as a society to realize that people with mental illnesses have emotional difficulties, usually difficulties from their childhood? What would it take for us as a society to realize that people who use heroin shouldn't be put in jail. They should be put in a trauma facility. You know, psychiatrists, I think, are just part of our society. I think like
broken system.
yeah. Psychiatry is a very interesting thing. I think it reflects the society in which it is created. I think society creates psychiatry, and it's vice. You know, it's a two-way relationship.
Yeah, it's a chicken and egg thing.
Yeah. So I think it's more a question about our society. Well, why as a society don't we realize these things? You know, and you know, those are big questions that I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah. Look, I just want to reiterate again, you know, how grateful we are to both of you. Fascinating. I feel like there should be part 3 next year as well now. No, it's just really, really exciting. And we might actually look at doing something like this for our summit next year in November, where we might have Patrycja actually interview you live if we can get you both to Melbourne and Beyond Borders and stuff, where we can put on stage together. I think it would be very interesting to do that. I think it's really lovely to see a psychologist and a psychiatrist collaborating in this way, and it makes me, and I hope many other people, just realize just, you know, how much we all want to work for the betterment of humanity and people who are suffering. And so I thank you both for that. Just before we go, we're just going to put on just a couple of quick final slides, just the how you can help slide Elan. So a few people are new to the family, to the team, to the movement. So if we can just put on the how you can help slide Elan. Oh, there's the psych support services. I should mention that. Sorry, just go back on that one very quickly. If you are using the medicines and need some support, we have wonderful psychologists who run a whole range of therapists all around Australia who support people using the medicines and or for other treatments and support, also peer supervision and so on. Next slide. Tim Ferriss, who's done an amazing amount of support for these medicines, both financially and getting the word out there. And he just talks about how important it is for all of us really to donate to this movement, because we literally can affect millions of lives. And next slide, thank you. How you can help: start conversations, share these webinars, start or join chapters, read our wonderful Learn section on our website, look at the YouTube videos, talk to your doctors, medical professionals, so that one by one we can start really helping people to understand these medicines and understand the science and not stigma. Same with members of Parliament. We need your support for either fundraising or donations, whatever you can do. We're donating a lot of time and money, but we can't do it alone, and we're fortunate to have the support of many different philanthropists. And no matter how small your donation, it's still very much appreciated, and we run very leanly. And please attend more of our events and our summit. Next slide, thank you. And that's the certificate in psychedelic assisted therapies. Really encourage you to join it. Eli is in the first intake, and the calibre of the participants who are applying is outstanding. Very excited about this program. Next slide, thank you. This is the summit. These are the confirmed speakers so far. Hopefully we're going to confirm Patrycja and Eli as well, and maybe Johan Hari, who we've spoken about tonight as well, who was very interested to come. I think. Final slide. Next slide, thank you, Elan. So these are the upcoming remaining webinars for this year, but we're also going to show the new documentary about Stan Grof, which is absolutely superb. I was fortunate enough to get a sneak peek of it the other night, and we're going to hold that as a final fundraising event online for anyone around the world in December. So we'll announce it shortly. But look, we just want to thank, we'll just take off the slide sharing now. Do register for the remaining webinars, and we really look forward to seeing all of you at our next events. Please bring along at least 2 people so we keep broadening the amount of people who are starting to learn about these medicines and this movement. And thank you all for your attendance. One of the remarkable things about these webinars is that people do stay on for pretty much the whole duration. So that just goes to show the caliber of these wonderful presenters, and we're very grateful to them. So thank you again, Patty and Eli. Thank you, Patty, for also being on our advisory panel. We value your contribution enormously. We want to see you in Melbourne soon, now that things are starting to hopefully
Well, I can't wait.
that'll be great. We can't either. We'll have to all go out for dinner. Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Wonderful.
Everyone, wonderful support. Thank you, guys.